In this clip, I'm going to talk about Memi's article on assigning value to difference. What Memi's trying to get us to see is that when it comes to issues of racial difference, it isn't that we are just discussing the difference between white and non-white. It's some kind of neutral perception of difference. But in distinguishing the difference between white and non-white, certain values have been assigned to these differences. Whiteness has been valued historically in this country much more than people of color have been valued in this society. Some people argue that that's still in place today, though it isn't as apparent as it was 50 years ago. And as we talked about with hegemony's ability to shift, while we see this diminishment of white power, fundamentally, hegemony would argue nothing has basically changed. So it is this idea that we don't just distinguish differences, we place a value to differences. And this idea of placing a value is important. Now to begin, Memi talks about a definition of racism. His definition of racism is the generalized and final assigning of values to real or imaginary differences. That these values are assigned to the benefit of the accuser and at the victim's expense. And it's done in order to justify the accuser's own privileges and aggression. Again, let me state that a second time. Memi defines racism as the generalized and final assigning of values to real or imaginary differences. They are assigned to the accuser's benefit and at the victim's expense. And it's done in order to justify the former's own privileges or the accuser's privileges and aggression. Now, what's important to understand about this definition of racism is that it's what is missing. And what is missing are the three elements that we usually use, or the three ideas that we usually use to define what makes a person racist: ignorance, fear, and hatred. Those three ideas are not part of Memi's definition. We can't sit there in society today and use ignorance as a reason for a racist attitude. The reason why is because people's access to information today, if you've spent any time in the U.S., you've learned, or you've been told, or you've been taught that racism is wrong. You can no longer sit there and say, well, that's just the way the person was brought up. Now, stereotypes could be caused by ignorance, that the person doesn't know anything other than the stereotype, so they could be ignorant to these other aspects, but racism is something different. And racism today has nothing to do with being ignorant of the idea that one race is superior over another. We know that's false. So it can no longer be used as a reason for a racist attitude. And fear and hatred don't cause racism. Racism causes fear and hatred. This final assigning of values is done in such a way as to produce fear in a certain group. Fear of that difference, or fear of losing power to those people he or she sees as different. And these final assigning of values to these imaginary or real racial differences causes hate, causes some people to hate. And this is what I mean, that fear and hatred does not cause racism. Racism causes fear and hatred. Now next, he tries to get us to understand how racism is a widespread mechanism, that it's a system of power. It's a system of ideologies that get us to believe that one race is superior and one race is inferior. This is the historical construction of differences in our society. But we must make it clear that in today's society, the differences, the generalized and final assigning of values to these real or imaginary racial differences It's not necessarily based on one race is superior and one race is inferior, but has shifted now to a one race is seen as normal or neutral, and one race is seen as something other than normal or something other than neutral. It's kind of like that hegemonic shift that I talked about before. What fundamentally has not changed is that all the power that was once associated with being a superior race is now shifted and is now associated with what it is to be the normal race. So while we see the idea or a lessening of white supremacy in our society, we see a greater tendency to see whites as normal or neutral in terms of race. And therefore, that normal or neutral has been assigned the value, the power, that was associated with what it was to be the superior race. He tries to get us to understand this widespread mechanism as the ability to use these generalities, these real or imaginary differences, as a way to describe the entire person or how the group works within a society. In many ways, we can see this in our society today. What we generally see in our society when it comes to the issue of identity or individual identity is that our society allows whites to be seen as individuals and people of colors is seen as belonging to a group identity. So when a person who is being racist, a white person who's being racist, is that individual's fault. Not talking about this larger structure, the systemic aspect of racism. So we can blame racism on the individual. But when a person of color acts, say, in a way that can be called reverse racist, we associate that person of color as a group identity. So again, this kind of ability to generalize, the accuser's ability to generalize these differences has set up a thing where we see whites in our society as having an individual identity and people of color as having a group identity. Memmi goes on to explain the 4 aspects of the development of this kind of racist attitude. He says first is stressing the real or imaginary differences between the racist and his victim. And the key point is stressing the real or imaginary differences. So we see in society that we have long, historically in this country, we have long put up these imaginary differences of intelligence, that whites are more intelligent than people of color. We then focus in and we stress these differences in intelligence in our society. He tries to get us to do that. He tries to get us to understand that not just any difference would do, that difference must be significant, like intelligence, like work ethic, like the ability to be a father or the ability to be a mother. These issues that are very significant to people in people's lives. And it's also done by emphasizing this difference, that these are the things we focus on, these differences in our society. He says that by emphasizing the difference, the racist aims to intensify or cause exclusion or separation of the subordinate group from the dominant group in living arrangements, work, social mobility, etc. So again, by emphasizing these differences, it's done so that the racist aims to intensify or cause exclusion and separation of the subordinate group from the dominant group. We see this with Native Americans and issues in their relationship to reservations. In order to keep the white race pure and in order to open up land for future economic development, differences had to be imagined, had to be created in such a way that whites were seen as superior, Native Americans as inferior, and created in such a way as to then, or these differences are emphasized in such a way that it sets up a type of exclusionary practice where the dominant whites excluded the Native Americans from participation in the society and moved them onto reservations. He wants us to get us to understand it is not the difference that entails racism. It is racism that makes use of the differences. We all have differences. We all are different in that kind of structure. But this difference is emphasized and focused on for particular purposes of granting one group of people access to power in ways it does not grant the other group of people. He wants us to understand that the difference is real or imaginary. If the difference is missing, then the racist invents a difference. If the difference is real, then the racist interprets the differences to his or her advantage. When expressing these differences, and especially the way we assign a value to these differences, it's done in such a way as to discredit the defendant and validate the accuser. This is what can be called the invalidation-validation process. When we started to look at racial differences, we didn't just see them as differences, so how these differences are neutral or not associated with power. What started to happen with the construction of race and racism was this type of invalidation-validation process. That these racial differences were expressed in such a way that the person of color, or the differences that made up that person of color, were invalidated in such a way that validated the racist's own beliefs or his own self-esteem. Let me say that again. These differences are set up in such a way as to invalidate the victim in such a way to validate the accuser. An example of this can be seen with the Jerry Springer show. I mean, a number of you have watched Jerry Springer. Some of you may still watch Jerry Springer on a regular basis. But why do we watch Jerry Springer? Is it because we see these kind of crazy people up on stage? Well, if it was just a spectacle, if it was just watching these crazy people, we would have lost interest. The novelty would have been lost. But what Jerry Springer has been able to do is tap into this very validation process of how we explain differences. Why do we watch Jerry Springer? Because when we see those crazy people up on stage, it tells us we're not one of them. You invalidate them as crazy people while validating who you are as a person as the only sane person. So that's what makes Jerry Springer so effective, is his ability to tap into this invalidation-validation process. This way of expressing placing the value on difference is done in this way. The next aspect of his racist attitude is placing or assigning a value on a difference. This value that's placed on difference is intended to do two things. One, to prove the inferiority of the victim. Now again, like I said, it isn't about inferiority, it's about something other than normal. But it is an idea to prove that the person of color or the victim are the ones who are different, that there is something wrong with their difference, in such a way as to make the accuser or the racist the superior person in the relationship. This differing process, he talks about how this process works. He says, first, any difference is likely to be suspect and deserve to be discredited. The racist sees difference as evil, not himself as evil. And that he sees difference as a threat to the established power. His third process is that the difference is generalized. He believes that all victims' personality is characterized by these differences. That these differences can be seen as stereotypes. And that all members of that group, a person's group, who is being victimized by this generalization process, are targeted because of these differences. That once a person is assigned a group identity, that group identity now affects every person in the same way. He says a victim is next. The fourth aspect that he puts on, that the difference is final. There is a social determinism. He's trying to get us to see that we don't assign these differences in such a way that there's a way to evolve or somehow eliminate these differences. That these differences are set up in such a way that they are given a final assignment of value. And even though we may shift our ways of looking at it, that a final assignment of value remains the same. That there is no hope for change, that once a problem, always a problem, that there is no salvation available, and that it doesn't need a connection to reality to become true. It can be that mythical representation. So in many ways, what he's trying to get us to understand is that this idea of differences are these various ideologies that are the mythical representations of our relationship to the real world. That these differences have been assigned to what it is to be white and what it is not to be white are social and false constructions of a society and its people. But yet, the way we have worked this racist assigning of value, we set it up in such a way that these changes, these differences, this value associated will never change. Now, there are certain ways that he talks about that the accuser, the racist, justify his or her behavior. One is scapegoating. Oh, it's their fault. We see that happening now with the immigration debate. If it wasn't for those Mexicans, our country would be a lot better off. Those Mexicans are taking our jobs, they're taking our taxes. It's a scapegoating. And really the problem isn't the immigrant. The problem is capitalism. And if we start to sit there, if capitalism and the economic ruling elites can get us to focus in as the immigrant as the problem, rather than the capitalist system as the problem, then the capitalist ruling elites maintain their power and control because we placed all our blame by scapegoating the Mexican. It's justified often by using alibis for racism. And one of the major alibis, as we'll talk about later on in the quarter, is what is called the new rhetoric of racism, which is to never mention race. To find every reason imaginable why you feel this way or why you've assigned a certain value to this difference, other than saying that the value is due to the issue of race. This justification is to eliminate any discomfort and anxiety that the racist might feel about his or her actions. It justifies injustice, to deal with the guilt the racist might feel because of his racist actions. The racist is not punished because a person deserves it. And this is an interesting point. Memi is saying is that racism, or the effect of racism on people of color, is not done because the person deserves to be treated that way. That the person is already being punished because of racism. And since the person is already being punished, then the injustice is justified because the person is guilty of being different. He goes on to believe that racism is the objective counterpart of the victim's objective situation. And racism has evolved in such a way, if society evolves, then the ills or negative aspects of society also evolve. These kind of hegemonic shifts to maintain power and control. So as we'll talk about, that there isn't only one type of racism. We'll see that there are several types of racism at work in our society today. We'll see that these types of racism are the best justification for oppression, or to somehow assign a negative value to the victim. And that the idea between value and difference are inherently connected in the way we've gone about describing difference and valuing difference in our society.